Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I am your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. Bob is off on assignment today. He has the day off, but we are going to be talking with Professor Joseph Brown, who is a professor and associate professor at UMass Boston of political science. And we're going to be talking about a popular topic here in the Green and Red podcast, which is around environmental protest, environmental direct action. Professor Brown is actually the author of a new article coming out in the journal Terrorism and Political Violence called Stop Cop City, Understanding the Strategic Choices of Protest Movements. So we'll be talking actually a lot about Stop Cop City today. But his first book was called Force of Words, The Logic of Terror Threats. And his second book, which will probably be out next spring, summer, is called For the Land and For the People in the Land, which is actually about environmental direct action. And a lot of his work focuses on political conflict, protest, state repression, terrorism, that sort of thing. Professor Brown, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Thanks very much, Scott. It's good to be here.
Yeah. And so we're going to be talking mostly about Professor Brown's article and talking about this Stop Cop City movement and some of what I would actually call evolution in direct action movements that we've seen just in the last few years, and Cop City being a really great example of that. But maybe start off with talking about, maybe we have new viewers in our audience who actually are not familiar with Cop City, although we've done many shows on Cop City. But tell us a little bit about the background of Cop City.
Yeah.
And I'll also ask specifically about Stop Cop City as well, but go ahead and just start with what Cop City is.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a good place to start. Cop City is the derisive nickname of a new police training facility in the greater Atlanta area. It's this sprawling facility, multiple tens of millions of dollars of cost to build it. I think ultimately a cost of like $118 million, combination of public and private money. And it's an extremely controversial project, particularly in the local community. There's a lot of division over it, division between what the government and big corporations and police lobbies want versus your average person in Atlanta or DeKalb County, where it's actually being built. In a nutshell, the plans for Cop City date back at least to 2017. It's the brainchild of this very powerful, very well-connected, very well-funded police lobby called the Atlanta Police Foundation, which as far back as 2017 wanted to build a fancy new training facility for area law enforcement. So Atlanta law enforcement, DeKalb County law enforcement, state law enforcement in that area of Georgia. And the facility would include a number of different varieties of infrastructure in it. So a new firing range, a classroom facility, a driving course for police to practice various driving maneuvers, a barn for police horses, a burn tower for fire departments to practice putting out fires. That part of the project is not super controversial. It's the police parts that have been really controversial. And the most controversial thing, I think, is that it would contain the idea was always for it to contain a simulated urban environment where police could practice various types of operations in urban settings. So like a simulated residential, commercial, like your average city block. And for rehearsing various types of things, but I think most controversially rehearsing riot control. So that project languished. It's a very expensive project. The Police Foundation was collecting private money to put up for it. They're very heavily funded by big companies that have some kind of presence in greater Atlanta. So Home Depot, Chick-fil-A, Coca-Cola, I think Wells Fargo. You can find a list of them online. So the Police Foundation was trying to raise money from them, but they also needed buy-in from the city of Atlanta, like some money and also a lease on the land to build it. They didn't get that follow through until 2020. And what happened in 2020 was the big racial justice uprising over the police killing of Black Americans and other Americans of color. People like George Floyd but also notably in Atlanta, Rayshard Brooks, a Black man who was shot dead, shot in the back as he was fleeing the scene of a prior altercation with police in the parking lot of a Wendy's.
And that happened right after the murder of George Floyd, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. And this touched off some of the most intense protests in 2020 in Atlanta, specifically Rayshard Brooks. And there are many different responses that you could have taken to the racial justice uprising, right? People were calling for a bunch of different things. Some of them were reforming the police. Some of them were defunding the police and putting money into social programs instead. Some of the proposals were abolishing the police. The city of Atlanta and the Police Foundation together chose Cop City as their response to the 2020 racial justice uprising. But they didn't really make that a big deal in public. They pushed the plans through without public discussion. Hard to know exactly why, but one potential reason is because they knew it wouldn't be an easy sell right after the 2020 racial justice uprising. But they were worried about some specific things. Police morale was really low. People were quitting the force. And part of the impetus for Cop City was that it might increase morale and encourage new people to join if they had this fancy new facility to do their training program in. The public didn't become aware of this until some enterprising local muckrakers discovered that this project was winding its way through government, and they made a stink about it and said, hey, I think this needs discussion. And only after that kind of outcry did City Council actually schedule some opportunities to discuss Cop City before taking a vote on whether the city would lease land and devote funds to make the project happen. It was the height of the COVID lockdown. City Council opened a voicemail box, and you could call in, leave comments for or against or whatever about whether you thought Cop City was a good idea. And then City Council would play the tape and theoretically hear out their constituents. Again, some local researchers listened to all the tape too. There's about 17 hours of recorded comment, and they classified the comments as for or against, and about 70% of the comments were against building Cop City. Not a lot of public demand for it. There are places in Atlanta where it was more popular. There's a neighborhood called Buckhead in the north of the city. It's much richer, much whiter than Atlanta.
Like the Beverly Hills of Atlanta.
Yeah, in a heavily Black city, there is this Beverly Hills-ish neighborhood that is heavily white, and the demand for Cop City, in as much as citizens were demanding it, was coming from Buckhead. But it was never going to be built in Buckhead, right? It was going to be built in someone else's backyard. City Council, after hearing 70-30 against, decided to vote for it by a pretty solid majority and authorized the leasing of a parcel of land for it. Not in Buckhead, in adjacent DeKalb County. So just outside, like the eastern boundary of Atlanta, in unincorporated DeKalb County, is this piece of land that the city of Atlanta has owned for a long time, and it's the site of an old prison farm. So some background on that land. It is indigenous land. It's Muskogee land. It was expropriated violently from its original caretakers, the Muskogee, who were then forced out, sent along the Trail of Tears very violently, and forced onto a reservation in Oklahoma. So the land is expropriated from them. It's turned into a plantation where a white plantation owner enslaved at least 19 or 20 Black people to labor and produce various crops in those fields. After the Civil War, emancipation happens, at least theoretically, but the form of slavery that we still have is prison slavery. And Atlanta converted that land into a prison farm where people who were incarcerated in the local Atlanta prison and jail system would work to produce food for other people in the prison system. So that's the very dark history of this parcel, which was then going to be converted into Cop City. In the intervening time, after the prison farm was closed down in the 90s, it went to seed. Like, the land wasn't really being used. A lot of trees grew up, a lot of animals moved in, and it became this kind of picturesque, like in a sort of dystopian way, picturesque forest area. There'd be like coyotes and deer, but also these decaying old prison buildings too, and like the bodies of former enslaved people like under the ground too somewhere.
And indigenous people from further back.
Exactly, yeah. Atlanta decided to lease that to build Cop City, but there's also like a broader area of forested land there, that roughly 380 acres of urban forest, which is a unique thing. Like cities don't usually have a giant forested area. Atlanta is the forest in the city, or the city in the forest. It's actually both, depending on how you want to look at it. There are these large forested areas, or there were, that people called the lungs of Atlanta. And the South River Forest, otherwise known as the Atlanta Forest, was one of those areas. About a square mile of forest, some of which is the old prison farm, and some of which is a public park called Entrenchment Creek Park. And bisecting that is Entrenchment Creek. It's this muddy body of water. And on the west side of it is the old prison farm where Cop City was going to be built. And on the east side is a public park with like jogging trails and a field for radio controlled airplane hobbyists. A nice recreational space for a working class / poor Black neighborhood, like an important city amenity for those folks. So I think it's important to talk about environmental racism here. Cutting down a bunch of that forest to build Cop City would have important environmental effects, specifically for the surrounding people of color in that area. Atlanta already likes to use that part of DeKalb County to put things that it needs built, but it doesn't want in its own backyard.
Right.
The working class Black folks there, the poor Black folks there, have to host 2 prisons, one for adults, one for children, 2 existing police firing ranges, so there's gunshots going off all the time already, a SWAT team training facility, or like a SWAT team base, and a sewage treatment plant, which overflows into Entrenchment Creek if you get more than a moderate amount of rainfall. And if you've ever been in the South in summer, you get like big thunderstorms. It regularly overflows and it smells pretty bad.
Right.
Cutting down a bunch of trees to build Cop City is only going to make that worse, because they won't be there to absorb excess rainwater and prevent erosion, right? So there's important environmental effects that a Black community, or a heavily Black community, is asked to shoulder so that Buckhead doesn't have to shoulder them. So that's the background of Cop City. And the movement to stop Cop City comes out of frustration with city council voting to...
Right. That's one question about Cop City before we get into the movement, or 2 questions really. Is one, a lot of the story, and this is definitely within like left circles, is that the model is based actually on Israeli training, that the Israelis actually are part of the sort of development of Cop City and Cop cities around the country, and that there's even going to be like Israeli instructors on site and things like that. Could you speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, Georgia is part of this exchange with law enforcement and counterterrorism. Put that in quotes because terrorism is like a very nebulous and problematic concept. But there's this thing called the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, GILI. GILI does include Israeli counterterrorism forces, and the program organizes joint training with those law enforcement or sort of paramilitary institutions in other countries. So it is true that Israeli counterterrorism people will be training in Georgia, and Georgia people will be training with the Israelis, and Cop City will be a locus of that, right? Predates Cop City, that program, but obviously with Cop City there, it's anticipated that that will be the new place to do those kinds of joint trainings.
Right. And then my other question is, Cop City is not unique in the United States. There's actually proposals to build Cop Cities all over the country. There's a proposal to build one here in the Bay Area. For example, it's called Cop Campus, actually. But
yeah, I think that this is perhaps the most famous example of a national trend, and they're controversial everywhere for different reasons, right? It might be about the history of the land, or like whose land is going to be used to build it. It might be because of like the resource allocation. There's various reasons locally why this project was unpopular, but I think the protest movement has made this a national issue as well, in addition to the local concerns. And I think it also touches on this broader problem of the increasing militarization of police in the United States, like the kinds of things that people will train to do there, and the kinds of things that were done to suppress the protest movement are its heavily militarized tactics that migrated home from the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. Drones, like
shock and awe.
surveillance technology, shock and awe. Yeah, that's the direction that things have gone, and this will push it more in that direction. That's what people are worried about.
I was at the Free Trade Area of the Americas protest in November 2003 in Miami, which is 6 months, 8 months, whatever, after the invasion of Iraq. And the Miami police force adopted the shock and awe model to deal with they did one another Seattle, right? So they adopted the shock and awe model and embedded journalists with their police units, all kinds of things like that.
We have that in common. I was at one of those big anti-globalization protests. It was the one in DC, and like right after the Seattle one in April of 2000. There was the DC
A16. It was A16.
A16, yes. And I still have a button. It says "Spank the Bank." And I just remember seeing the police on the roofs with these very scary rifles that seemed to have like grenade launchers under them. And it was like my first whiff of tear gas. It was a very formative experience of going from being a liberal to being a radical, because I was just like, wow, we did all the nice liberal things and the police knocked out my friend's teeth. So what does this mean for how our society runs?
Yeah, I actually think the anti-globalization moment was actually an important step in the increasing militarization of domestic police in the U.S. So many other steps along the way, and 2020 being a big one.
Yeah.
But back to Stop Cop City, before I start asking questions, you were going to talk a little bit about the movement. Can you actually tell us a little bit about Stop Cop City, the movement to stop Cop City in Atlanta?
Yeah, it's a really amazing movement, I have to say. Like, being close to it has been really inspiring, and it's shown so as a scholar who's pivoting over time from studying really extreme forms of political violence to protest movements that suffer some extreme forms of political violence used against them, this is a really interesting thing to be associated with. I think it's an important movement because it really embodies the idea of a diversity of tactics, and it also embodies this sort of go along to get along attitude in a movement where there's many different kinds of people making common cause. So after the city council voted to authorize Cop City, despite a lot of public opposition, people took a few different approaches to continuing to resist it. Some of them kept doing the perfectly legal, let's participate in liberal democracy kinds of things, like going to further government meetings, canvassing neighborhoods to raise awareness, writing letters, doing petitions, following the mayor around and demanding that he explain himself, like, why do you support this project? And doing that was a variety of local people, some of them very not especially radical in their actions. People also chose to resist it via other means that were a little more risky. People started doing civil disobedience actions. One form of civil disobedience that's really associated closely with this movement is forest occupation, tree sitting, which is a classic tactic you'd associate with the environmental movement. And you can see Stop Cop City as part of environmental work, because it is people trying to protect a forest using the traditional tactics of forest defense. You build a tree sit, you climb the tree, you refuse to get out of the tree, which means that theoretically they can't cut the tree down unless they want to kill you or severely injure you. You put your body on the line, classic nonviolent direct action. But all of that is in service of what's basically a racial justice cause. It's an outgrowth of the 2020 racial justice uprising, and it just happens to take place in a forest. The people who were good at defending forests already and had these skills came to Atlanta to assist. And so you got like environmentalist style civil disobedience as part of this movement to resist the police killing of Black Americans. In addition, people did some more controversial stuff. There's multiple construction projects taking place in that area. One half of the Atlanta forest, the public park half, is under threat by a different development project. There's this Hollywood billionaire, Ryan Millsap, you can Google him, who wanted to build a sound stage by leveling a large chunk of Entrenchment Creek Park. And so people resisting that project or the Cop City project would also use sabotage, right? Excavation machines, feller bundlers, whatever equipment in the area that was left unattended might experience various forms of mechanical failure or mishap. Things were catching fire in the area of the Atlanta forest, actually even before the tree sitters got there. Cop City is authorized, but the funding's authorized in late 2021, or the public comment is late 2021. It gets authorized, and then as early as May 2022, things start catching fire. And the tree sitters arrive shortly thereafter. And so the movement has always had people pursuing different avenues of resistance to the project. Another avenue of resistance is like physical confrontations with law enforcement or contractors. So people who would come into the woods trying to remove the tree sitters, whether it was to build Cop City or to build the Hollywood soundstage, would encounter people in camouflage throwing rocks at them until they left, or like shooting off fireworks to scare them away. So it's a very diverse movement in terms of who participates and also how they participate. It was always associated with this long-term campaign of forest occupation. October of 2021, the tree sits go up, people arrive. Through January of 2023, there is this forest village on the Entrenchment Creek Park side of things, operating in collaboration with people building other forms of infrastructure on the prison farm side of things, including tree sits. And that was always part of the movement, and it helped to keep the woods from getting cut down for either of those projects until police started really violently trying to clear the woods. And they tried to clear the woods a bunch of different times. The first big SWAT raid was May of 2020. They thought they had cleared the woods. They didn't clear the woods successfully. People rebuilt the infrastructure that was destroyed. Police raided the woods a couple times over the summer and fall, like probing, not successfully able to clear the woods. They finally just decided to use overwhelming force in December of 2022 for the first time, sending in, I think, about 100 police with like long guns, body armor, like the green.
Super militarized.
Yeah. There's like different varieties of police going into the woods, and there's like the sort of the blue variety and the green variety, and like the green variety have like the fancy guns and the helmets and all that. They're looking like they're gonna invade a war zone. Multiple helicopters, drones, police dogs, and they really violently attacked the tree sits with tear gas and pepper balls, and like doing things that could severely injure a person. Shooting tear gas up into a tree, or shooting a pepper ball or a plastic bullet up into a tree, you're quite likely to hit somebody in the eye. Like really stuff.
So when they were going in and clearing like the tree sits, that had there already been these what I would call insurrectionist tactics where they're being confrontational with the workers and using sabotage, things like that? Is that what sort of triggered them going in and being like very aggressive and violent with the tree sits?
So that had always been part of the movement. Like that was always there. There were cases in the summer of 2022 where contractors would try and go in on either side and get chased off. Some of Ryan Millsap's bulldozers got chased off a couple times in 2022. One of his work trucks the work crew got chased off, and then the work truck caught fire. So there's always been stuff like that with confrontations, but never like, I would describe those things, I guess, at most as unarmed violence, right? It wasn't, there was like shooting matches or whatever. It was like, okay, the work crew has come in, they get chased off by a much larger number of people, and like maybe some rocks get thrown at them until they run away. That sort of thing had always happened. What was different was with these big police raids, you had like state police, local police from Atlanta and DeKalb, the state Bureau of Investigation, the state Homeland Security people, and then like federal agencies as well. So a lot of resources getting thrown in.
So fusion center raids.
They finally managed to arrest tree sitters in December of 2022, and they charged them in at least like right away with domestic terrorism under a Georgia law. A law that was passed to, the impetus to pass it was actually white supremacists.
Yeah, it was Dylan Roof's shooting of the church in Charleston, if I recall, right?
There's this really unfortunate thing where well-intentioned liberals want to use the terrorism law and sort of both sides it, like, oh, you're going to You're going to call environmentalists terrorists. The solution is that we should call white supremacists terrorists too. But that boomerangs back on you. And so that law that was passed to deal with people like Dylan Roof establishes a penalty of 5 to 35 years in Georgia state prison for the crime of domestic terrorism. And here the tree sitters were getting charged with domestic terrorism.
I remember when that happened. And,
yeah.
And then a month later, when we see Tortuguita assassinated by the Georgia police, correct? A month later.
That's January of 2023. Again, police tried and couldn't manage to clear the woods out in December of 2022. So people filtered back in, and the Governor Kemp in Georgia had been issuing some pretty scary statements on social media saying, we're not done with these agitators. We won't tolerate terrorists. And there's more of this coming, which was pretty spooky. And then in January, he sent in another task force led by the Georgia State Patrol, Georgia Bureau of Investigation. They went into the forest. They got really deep into the forest, and a forest defender who had been part of the occupation since May of 2022, living in the forest off and on. Young person, 26 years old, queer, non-binary, person of color, of indigenous descent, immigrant. Also just a really sweet, kind person.
Right.
Was caught in their tent and surrounded very quickly and shot up with pepper balls and then live ammunition. Still murky circumstances about exactly what happened, but the forensics are pretty brutal. They were shot. They had 57 different gunshot wounds. It's just a really grisly way to lose someone.
Yeah, it was I remember following it very closely. It was a terrible moment. And it was a terrible police murder.
Yeah, they were camping perfectly legally too. It's just amazing. Like, you could be doing things that are completely legal and within your rights. And the police were told to arrest everyone, even the ones camping legally in the park. And like, they were told they were arresting terrorists. And that's the approach the government took to dealing with forest defenders.
And you had interviewed Tortuguita a couple of times during your field research, right?
Yeah. So I interviewed them for the first time in the summer of 2022. And my original plan was to use a pseudonym for them, because I always do that. I've done research in former conflict zones, doing research on protests, especially when protesters are going to get criminalized. You use pseudonyms, you keep everybody anonymous. And originally, their name in the article and the book was going to be Lucky. They just had this really happy-go-lucky attitude about them, someone who was just really like relentlessly positive and whose greatest joys in life were giving things and sharing things. They were a person who would like meet and greet the new folks arriving in the woods, make sure they had a tent, make sure they had food, a place to stay. And so I interviewed them thinking that they were going to be an anonymous subject and they didn't want to be recorded or anything, but I have some quotes that are in the article in the book, and then just a bunch of other interactions with them where I got a feel for them as a person and ultimately as a friend. They're very, very friendly, like a very normal young person. I think it's important not to make people into heroes or martyrs. I feel like those can be kind of demobilizing. If you think of someone as a hero because they're taken by the state, you might think, oh, I can't do forest defense because I'm not a hero. I can't use him because I'm not a hero. Tort was a very normal person, but like a person who followed through on their principles. And that comes through in their, I asked them, like, what do you think about this whole eco-terrorism business? And they just laughed it off. They're like, they want to scare us with that. And police are the ones. Police use terror to quell rebellion, is what they said. And that was just, it was really hard to get after what happened.
And the state of Georgia ran a pretty nasty smear campaign against Tort after they killed them, correct?
Yeah, against them. And also we can get to the legal repression aspect of this too, right? Like the day that this happened, they had the Georgia, I think it was the Georgia State Patrol spokesman on TV with a bunch of different stories. It really evolved. At first it was like, oh, this terrorist came out of the tent shooting at us, guns blazing. Like, it is true, a police officer was shot during this encounter. But like initially there was this story of, oh, this terrorist has come out shooting at us unprovoked, and then it evolved. It's hard to remember exactly what the stories were because it's just infuriating at how absurd they were. But like the state's line was always, this person was a terrorist. And then after gunning this person down, like this person who did nothing to provoke anyone, right? This is the other thing about tort. They were like a conciliatory person. If there was something that needed to be de-escalated, tort was the person who stepped forward to de-escalate it.
Right.
Tort also specifically told me on multiple occasions, when the police arrive, that's not safe for me. I go back into the woods away from the police and I let white people handle if they're willing to step forward and be the sort of buffer. It's just like the police narratives are just opposition.
Well, the officer who got shot, I think it was later proven that they were actually hit by friendly fire because of the hail of bullets in which they unleashed on tort, correct?
I don't think it's been proven.
Okay.
There's been some stuff that's come out more recently. Like, I think it's also important not to get into the deserving victim, undeserving victim thing. It was the South. Like, tort owned a handgun. That's accurate.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the police ought to kill you.
Yeah, it's true.
And like, tort was also like in a tent, minding their own business on public land, and police started shooting pepper balls at them at range close enough to maybe kill a person. I don't know what happened next. I don't know how the police officer was shot, but it also doesn't matter. Like, pretty clear what the consequences were, and it's pretty clear who was in the right, morally speaking.
Yeah.
The moral that movement.
And how in civil society, I would actually say, responded in a surprising way. You saw the Sierra Club and the NAACP and like more mainstream groups like that come out in great support of insurrectionists and tree sitters. And it was 350.org as well came out and led on a lot of stuff. And I think that was an interesting dynamic too. And just to get into some of your kind of analysis out of the article is that it's a sort of evolutionary moment for these different movements. We see intersection, we see what I would say is like some people being able to deal with philosophical differences in a way in which I haven't seen them deal with before. I don't see the Democratic Party doing this, but it's interesting to see the Sierra Club and 350 actually be moving, evolve in this way, which I see as somewhat positive, especially with what we're facing now.
Yeah. And I feel like that was there before tort was killed, but I feel like
it's definitely that it was there some in 2020 as well. I agree with that.
Yeah. What's really remarkable, I think, so tort was killed and then people tried to reoccupy the forest, right? The police cleared it. They shot someone dead and then they assumed they had cleared it. People came back in March. There was this massive week of action. People processed. They had a peaceful march into the woods. And they had a memorial service to tort. They like sprinkled some of their ashes there. Tort's mom came to the woods. And then they were having this music festival to celebrate the reoccupation and the renewal of the resistance. Allegedly, a number of people went over onto the Cop City construction site and torched some equipment and did this big sabotage thing and threw some things at police, chased them away. And then police raided the music festival and arrested 23 people at the music festival and charged them with terrorism. The conventional wisdom of the political science literature on nonviolent protest is that at this point, liberals should run away screaming from the movement. If you had to place a bet, you would bet on the liberals running away because their nice peaceful event got spoiled by insurrectionary alleged anarchists allegedly setting fire, shooting fireworks at the police, right? That's not at all what happened. In fact, you saw the Sierra Club and like the avowedly pacifist Quakers of the American Friends Service Committee and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, not exactly an insurrectionary organization, signing this statement in solidarity with the protesters, including the ones charged with terrorism, condemning the government for its violence, condemning the government for killing a protester, condemning Cop City, and not saying anything about protesters needing to keep their tactics, quote unquote, peaceful. As I was doing this research, I fully expected liberals to run away screaming, and they never did, which was absolutely fascinating and surprising. Like, I was expecting the conventional wisdom to play out, and it didn't. And I think there's some things to learn from that. Like, what actually happened, since I've had a chance to talk to people who were there as all that was happening, like the statements were getting crafted, the liberals were deciding how to respond. Some people did get very uncomfortable with the riot that had happened, but people went to them and said, look, you don't have to support sabotage or rioting. You just need to not say anything about it publicly, but to please keep doing the good work that you're doing in terms of raising awareness, lending public support, filling out the ranks of our marches, and helping us collect signatures for this new petition that we're going to do to try and cancel out the funding of Cop City at the ballot box. There's this new petition initiative, the Vote to Stop Cop City campaign, and the NAACP and the Quakers and the Park Avenue Baptist Church and a bunch of other reputable community organizations helped to collect 116,000 signatures to put a referendum on the ballot. And if you read the social media of that campaign, which includes the moderate, the Quaker types, they say solidarity with all tactics on the road to liberation. It's really remarkable. And I think it's because of that kind of behind the scenes diplomacy of people saying, you might not do this yourself, you might not be super comfortable with it, but think about the broader goal here of stopping racialized police violence, and think about the fact that the police have killed a protester, and that's the problem. We all agree on that. Let's not recriminate each other publicly. We can have some tense discussions behind closed doors, but we'll maintain a unified public front and at least tacitly coordinate with each other. And there's room for all of us in this coalition because we know what's important and we know what the stakes are.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was an important moment. It actually makes me think of that Against Me song. Are you familiar with Against Me? Baby.
What's
baby,
the song?
Baby, I'm an anarchist. Yeah. And there's a line in it that goes, when it came time to throw the brick through that Starbucks window, you left me all alone. Which is not what's happening. And I think it's an important evolution that we've seen. And you also in the article talk a little bit about how Stop Cop City is like challenging these long-standing understandings of violent versus nonviolent, which is a person who's been involved in organizing and activist and anarchist circles for a long time. It's been the sort of, and it still pops up here in the Bay Area. It's this long-standing debate about nonviolence preachers versus people who like property destruction is not violence, all of that sort of stuff. And so it really is. I think that's an important point that comes out of your article as well.
Yeah, I think there's always been many different notions of what violence and nonviolence are. And what I do in the article is try and get forest defenders' notions of what nonviolence and violence mean and contrast that with the notions that pervade the political science literature. And the political science literature, for the most part, has a very narrow notion of nonviolence. Like, you don't hurt people, you don't destroy things, right? So property has that moral status where if you damage someone else's property, that's violent, right? So capitalist property relations are written into the notion of nonviolence, right? You could destroy all of your own property. I don't know if that's going to count, but if you destroy someone else's property, now you're violent. Versus what people in the woods would say and people outside the woods doing public relations, right? Like, the support community and the radicals in the woods agreed, by and large, that acts of sabotage did not qualify as violence because the community knew what violence was. Violence was police killing Rayshard Brooks, and violence was police killing Tortuguita. And violence is the fact that police every year in America kill 1,300 people. That's like a wartime level of violence in the world of political science. That if you have 1,000 battle deaths a year, it's a war, right? We have 1,300 police killings a year, and that's just normal business.
Business as usual.
Yeah, that's just law enforcement. So like, the movement adopts this idea of nonviolence includes pretty much anything that doesn't hurt people. Could be your march, could be your petition, could be your tree sit, could also be decommissioning an excavator, destructively or not. And that's nonviolence. You cross over into violence when you start harming other humans or other living things. And like, Obviously, there's still even gray areas, like what about rock throwing? But it's an expansive notion of nonviolence, and it comes from communities that experience lethal violence from the state, and that does frame your perspective. And also people, for the most part, having a kind of anti-capitalist morality, right? They're interested in the welfare of humans, also ecosystems, and they've experienced the death of a fellow member of the movement. They don't have a lot of spare tears for an excavator.
No, I think that's important. I also think some of those notions are actually becoming more mainstream in a sense. I think we're in this process right now in this country, which has become very stark in the last like 3 or 4 months, about how the elite are just don't care about anybody, including their own base, which is strange. And so therefore, I think the more you see someone like Luigi Mangione shoot a CEO, or you saw the burning of the police precinct in Minneapolis, more and more people becoming like sympathetic with this idea that nonviolence is not what it always has, what we've always been told it was.
I think that the notion of nonviolence is sometimes more salient and at other times less salient too. Like notions of nonviolence vary from place to place. And like the salience of nonviolence varies from place to place. People in the woods were not very interested in discussing nonviolence and violence as a binary, right? That they found the rhetoric limiting. It sparks recriminations. It's not helpful. It doesn't help to plan actions. Some of the things that helped the forest occupation last as long as it did were like the pairing of the classic nonviolent direct action tree sit with the rioters protecting the tree sitter by throwing objects and chasing away the arborist. I think that the movement mixed tactics in the forest occupation in really new and interesting ways. I don't know that the heavily defended tree sit was part of the environmentalist repertoire quite as much prior to this, or like the extended woodland riot, because you could actually label the whole forest defense as a nonviolent forest camp, or you could label it as a multiple month riot if you want. It depends on how you want to frame the definitions of those things. But people were not so interested in those conceptual discussions and more interested in throwing as many things against Cop City all at the same time and figuring out later what was effective. And I think they held it together because people adopted this sort of St. Paul's principles of we're not going to do it.
I was going to bring that. I was going to bring you that was influential. Hey, I'm going to pause this for a minute because, so I guess my last question is, as we're in this sort of new political moment, which is unprecedented, at least I think there's some parallels to the first Red Scare from 100 years ago, as you've been witnessing the sort of development of Cop City and then the movement against it. And we're seeing we're seeing a lot of big mobilization right now, like 51, and these May Day protests like about a week ago or so were pretty big, and there's more of those are coming up. Do you see the sort of do you think we'll see a greater radicalization of people, like getting more of those people in the mainstream, more of the people in that sort of liberal progressive sphere involved in more radical stuff? And do you think we'll see a bigger crackdown? One thing I get from a lot of activists and organizers and smart people is that they're really worried that Trump is actually wanting to bait people into having a more radical response, like what we saw in Minneapolis in 2020, or what we saw at Cop City, so that he can actually use real violence and real force more than even this non-lethal force that we've become accustomed to in the last 20 or so years.
My own default position on that is not to blame the protesters for whatever state repression comes down on them.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And here's an anecdote from the article and from the book. I had an extended conversation with an interviewee who pointed out that like the people doing perfectly legal things outside the woods, they did the peaceful marches and they still got thrown down to the pavement and brutalized by the police. And another person said the tree sitters got charged as terrorists, which is like a 35-year felony if they if they convict you and give you the whole thing. What incentive do you have to restrict your tactics if the response from the government is the same, right? Like, you present with nonviolence, they brutalize you. You present with nonviolence, they charge you with terrorism. And, in either case, you can't really blame the person and their tactical choices for what the government decided to do in response.
Also
Obviously,
similar to what happened on the encampments last year as well.
yeah, exactly. I don't know what it is about tents that turns police into rabies mode, but they really hate tents. And like, tents are not oppressing anybody. But boy, do they get violent when they see a tent.
It's true. It's so true.
I think it's important not to like point fingers at each other when the government is violent and say, "Oh, you naughty radicals, you made this happen." That choice was the police's choice to make, or the governor's choice to make, or the president's choice to make. Like, they make their own decisions. But I do think that if they are super repressive, it does decrease one barrier to people escalating their tactics. Like, if you expect violence from the state regardless, then things do take on this kind of like urgency, and you get frustrated, and it's hard to tell you're wrong for trying different things. I think that's part of what happened in Atlanta. The government was so repressive in response to very benign tactics. So people expanded their comfort zones a bit. I think another thing that happened was people grasping intersectional thinking. This is an important part of the article in the book. Environmentalists historically hew to a pretty narrow notion of nonviolence. Some of them dabble a little bit in sabotage or property destruction even, but they're generally not, they don't escalate that much. But they made common cause in Atlanta with people who were out in the streets dealing with like very urgent life or death issues like racialized police killings. And I think that increased environmentalists' willingness to tolerate tactics that might have made them a little uncomfortable in the absence of that intersection with racial justice and Black lives. And you look at, there's statements from some of the really important, like, outward facing Black public spokespeople of the movement saying, we're not just here for Black lives. Obviously we are. We're also here for Palestinians because of this connection to the IDF and Israeli counterterrorism. Whatever they do at Cop City in the way of training is going to get used against Palestinians. And when Israel started bombing Gaza into rubble and doing genocidal starvation of people in Gaza, you'd hear the organizers in Atlanta and also on college campuses like Emory, you'd see the iconography of Stop Cop City and Save Gaza. And people are willing to do or to take bigger risks when they make common cause with other people whose lives might be even more on the line than theirs.
You talk about the anti-Mountain Valley Pipeline movement and how actually there was an element of that which contributed to the tree hits. One of the things, I think the genocide in Gaza started in the end days of that campaign. And you actually saw people who were locking down at the Mountain Valley Pipeline with Palestinian flags.
Yeah.
And definitely doing intersectional narrative building there, or whatever you want to call it.
There was a Palestinian flag in the outdoor kitchen in the Entrenchment Creek encampments the whole time. There was always a Palestinian flag there. And I think that kind of solidarity increases people's sense of urgency, and that might go some way to explaining why the movement was so tolerant of tactics that might have proved polarizing in other settings. Like, the literature says they're polarizing, that it's based on data. I don't always agree with the way that it's coded, but things are contextual. And if the context is people are increasingly finding solidarity with other folks whose lives are on the line, maybe lives on the line even more than their own, then they're willing to tolerate a little bit more escalation, or maybe even do a little more escalation themselves. Like, tree sitters didn't always mesh well with rioters, but like in a racial justice movement, when everybody's bumping up against each other, these multiple streams converge, and you get this interesting hybrid of the people who were just doing tree sits before with people who were throwing rocks in 2020 or setting fire to barricades in 2020, and it all mixes together. And one of the things that helps people get over those differences is an awareness that the stakes aren't just the trees. Not that there's anything wrong with just being there for trees, but like also you're there for Black lives and you're there for Palestinian lives.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I think that's actually a good note to end on. That's a good closing line there for the interview. Professor Joseph Brown, it's been great talking to you today, talking about Stop Cop City, and evolving movements and evolving strategies and tactics. So your book will be out next year. And tell us the title of it again.
It's For the People and the Land, Direct Action, Environmental Justice.
And it'll be about Cop City as well as the struggle with the Wet'suwet'en in Western Canada as well, correct?
Yep. Stop Cop City and the Wet'suwet'en defense of their land.
Yep. Folks, if you want to check us out more, go to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. And if you really like us, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit the support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And we will talk to everybody again soon and go out and make trouble and misbehave.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, great to have you.